Hello and welcome to this new training session at Dom Solar. Today we are going to look at the Kogysun system. I will show you the parts live via the camera. There will also be a presentation and a slideshow. And then a few examples of layout planning. So the Kogysun system is designed to be used on dry tray and sandwich panel roofs. And as far as I know, it's the only one certified for use on rock wool sandwich panels in France. It's from the trapezoidal range for the trays. We have a technical approval for the dry tray and a technical approval for the sandwich panel. And in addition, we've also included an ETN, which allows us to fit as many modules as possible onto our systems. But be aware that even for the technical approvals, we issue module amendments. What I recommend is to regularly check our website for updates to our technical approval to see if there have been any module amendments, and above all, to review this technical approval before starting your project. There's even a chart listing the modules that have been added. If you're working within the technical approval, Kogysun is generally installed with a purlin spacing of around 2 meters, 2.30 meters. You can go up to 2.30 meters. Of course, for every system, every installation, and every roof, we will provide you with a calculation note. So just because you have a roof with a purlin spacing of 2 meters doesn't mean you can install the Kogysun system. We have to consider the heights, the exact location, whether it's a single pitch or double pitch roof, which is why it's important for you to provide us every time you request a study with as much information as possible about your roof. So the technical data sheet for the panel is what you'll use first. But of course, if you want to be technically compliant, it has to match our technical approval. So Kogysun is installed with a wave height. This is the E you see on the screen, which should be between 30 and 45. And you need to use trapezoidal panels with the modules installed only in landscape orientation. And the spacing between the waves should be either 333 or 250. If you have a project near the sea, be aware that Kogysun can only be installed at least 1 kilometer from the sea. Any closer than that, you cannot use our system. On our end, we are required to submit a request to ArcelorMittal, our steel supplier, to determine whether we need to add extra protection to our Oreos, which are made of manili steel. And if it turns out that additional protection is needed, it could jeopardize your project because it would inevitably double the cost. But in any case, this will give you a minimum guarantee of 10 years. Before the system is installed, we conduct a study, and we really need as much information as possible. The exact location, the structural plans with the purlin details, the type of purlin. And please don't hesitate to send us photos. So Kogysun is installed on the ridge. So the flashing sheet that will be on the ridge, it's important for us to know what it's like. Is it raised a little? If so, we might not be able to secure it. Is it flat compared to the corrugation of the tray? So it's very important to send us all this information. And then often on panneau, actually panneau sandwich, you have the tray is fixed under the flashing sheet. So that can be a problem for attaching our ridge riser. So it's really important to go and check all this information. And some projects are secured with a roof hook. Be aware that with Kogysun, you need to be very careful. Will we be able to install it? You'll need to go check on the roof, possibly with a dedicated support. And as for staples, no, we can't install our system if the tray has been fixed with staples. Please make sure to send us the technical sheet that the roofer will use on their tray, especially for panel, sandwich, and wood purlin roofs. In fact, they will use a screw, and maybe you'll ask us to provide you with the screw as well. And we are required to provide you with at least the same size, if not a larger one. We shouldn't send you a screw that's smaller than the one the roofer uses. And that's why it's important to know which screw it is that the roofer will use. The plans, that's very important. The covering sheet metal, if you can find it on the plans, does it, for example, go on a single pitch roof? Will it cover this purlin with threading? Will we need to install a threaded support, or will we use a standard support? So it's good to have that information ahead of time. The covering sheets, when it's a double pitch roof as well, it's important to know whether they properly cover both purlin. Will your photovoltaic system be installed on both slopes, or is it only on one slope? And it's also about seeing what the shape of your trim sheet is like. So photos and plans are extremely important for laying out the installation. After each signed quote, we create a layout plan for you. We'll provide you with the complete list of materials. The list of materials is really down to the exact piece. Usually upon delivery, you'll receive a little extra. But there's a cover page with the gauge, meaning the length of the module. We'll talk more about that in the presentation. And then the lengths, the width of the generator, the length of the slope, and these are all the details that you will have provided to us. And then the dimensions of the rails. So for Kogysun, we use rails that are either 4290 or 4660. You'll find all this information in the layout plans. And it's important to check, of course, on the project when you're up on the roof, to check these rails a bit, well, actually to check all your parts. The Kogysun system uses aerial supports that correspond to tray zones of 3.45, so a height of 45. If you have a tray that's less than 30, we'll provide a small ceiling shim. The ridge risers, which are flatter, are installed on the cladding sheet. And then, as I mentioned, it's between the 8th and 9th module. You could consider that every 8 meters, you have a generator separation. There is continuity of the rails along the slope. But be aware that between the 8th and 9th module, you will have a separation of at least 80 millimeters. So you will have external fastenings on each module. On site, you will need to cut your rails. So when you position your rails before cutting them on the roof, make sure to check your overhangs carefully. With Kogysun, the lower rail overhang is 200 millimeters from the center of the purlin, and the upper overhang is 40 centimeters from the center of the purlin. On the roof, before starting, you will check your plans and the dimensions of the roof. So you will measure precisely from edge to edge how well your entire roof is constructed, how significantly large your generator is, and you will carefully place the lower rail on the designated tray to meticulously see if it properly matches the tray precisely. And if we need to add this critical CIO that is positioned precisely between the crest of the tray's wave and the REOs, if additional robust sealing is indeed required, then this step is essential. I'll show you that right now on the screen. So here it is, whether it's on BACnet, SC, or on a very important and widely used protocol. Panel sandwich. And when you eventually make your way to the roof of the structure, you will then carefully take your designated riser and meticulously check to ensure that it fits properly and securely with the corresponding tray, confirming a precise and stable connection. If it's indeed 45, normally it will sit flush. If it's 40, you'll need to add a CO, so either 4 millimeters or 8 millimeters. We'll provide you with that information based on the height and the technical sheet for the tray that you've used. And you'll probably need to slide it underneath to check if it matches your roof, and especially to ensure proper waterproofing. So it's very important to check this right from the start. Once you know where you're going to start with your generator, you've made a mark on your roof. Then you'll proceed to mark the corrugations of the tray so you can install your supports. You'll prepare 2 gauges to the dimensions of the module, plus the gap between each module. By default, we will set this gap at 9 millimeters for you. If you want a larger gap, please let us know in advance. You can have 15 to 20 millimeters between the module columns. Of course, you need 2 technicians for this. Place the first gauge, and then the other one will go against the mark for the chosen gap, 9, 15, or 20 millimeters. And you will mark the peaks of the corrugations using the 333 millimeter markers. Use construction marking spray paint in different colors. This makes it easier to identify the corrugations on the tray and also to spot the gap between the modules. It's a good idea to use a different color for this marker. What will happen after a while when you place your gauges is that you will transfer the marks, gauge 1 onto gauge 2 onto gauge 1, and so on from edge to edge. And at some point, in fact, you'll end up with a marker that falls between 2 corrugations. I'll try to draw this gauge for you between the 2 corrugations. So you might find yourself maybe like this. Between 2. and your marker here precisely positioned in the very center. This will be 33, which will be located on and the other one, on the other hand, you'll only have a single corrugation mark. So what you'll do first is mark the corrugation here where there's only one of your markers after just one corrugation. Then you'll go back to the other corrugation and place the first one. You could just as well place the second one. What you really need to keep in mind is that if you have 2 rails under each module, you need at least 1 meter. So you could very well put this marker on this corrugation. Remember, 2 rails under the modules means a minimum of 1 meter. Mark each corrugation with a color to receive your supports. And then for the spacing between your modules, you take another color, and you can even number your module columns starting from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. That's generally the feedback we get. Next, on the slope, you'll lay out your rails without cutting them. So here on the screen on the left, you have a typical layout representation with a 4.66 meter rail, a 4.47 meter rail that has been cut, and a 3.48 meter rail that has been cut. And then you have the gap between the 8th and 9th module, as I mentioned earlier, which is at least 8 centimeters. But before getting to that point, actually, you will lay out your rails on the slope without cutting them, starting where we indicated on the plan. For example, with a 20 centimeter overhang at the bottom of the purlin, and you will do this by laying out 3 rails on the slope. If your project has 3 rails on the slope, use 3. If you have 4, use 4. If you have 2, use 2. If you have 2, use 2. Then see how it lines up at the edge and in the middle of the roof. And then check with a chalk line. Lay out a chalk line without fixing it, and see with the chalk line if right from the start with the overhang things are already looking good. Maybe you need to lower one side, or maybe you need to allow for more, but never more than 200, be careful. Or maybe you need to raise it. At the top, it should never be more than 400 millimeters. So pay attention to that. And then once you're sure about the starting point, you can fix the first track, provided that all your supports are already installed. But at least check where your track cuts will be. Don't just cut everything without checking. You need to check everything beforehand and say to yourself, okay, the 447 track, that's going to work. Be aware that between the 8th and 9th module, you must absolutely avoid having the 8th module straddling the 2nd and 3rd rails in the slope. With Kogysun, it always works in pairs, let's say 2 rails on the slope, and you can have a maximum of 8 modules on these 2 rails. And then there's a separation. You can start again with 8 modules, but in any case, do not have a module, the 8th module, for example, straddling 2 rails. So there are some small differences depending on whether you're using backsec or panel sandwich. With backsec, your risers are attached with a screw directly into the purlin, just one screw. Whereas if you're using sandwich panels, you have to enlarge the hole in the tray to insert a spacer. So be very careful about that. You need a 10.5 millimeter drill bit. And you also need to add a stitching screw, the 6.3 by 45, which you will screw in very gently. Always at the bottom relative to the slope, it's always the stitching screw at the bottom and the purlin screw at the top. So be careful when working with sandwich panels. And of course, don't forget the CIO if you need it for waterproofing. You'll see in several slides, I occasionally show the screwdriver again. Impact drivers are forbidden even when you're screwing into the purlin. In fact, over time, you'll weaken the screw head. I'm going to show you on screen how to install these famous risers and also the small insert in the sandwich panel. So you either have the small CEO for additional waterproofing, the lower riser, and then as we will see in some specific places, you will also need a locking riser, which is typically found still on the first purlin and still between the 8th and 9th module. It's actually on the 3rd rail in the barrier. The first purlin you encounter, you'll have this famous locking riser. Otherwise, all of the other risers are quite standard, with the main ridge riser located here, which of course is completely flat since it is precisely placed on the primary cladding sheet, as you can clearly see, and you attach it to the purlin. So with the sandwich panel, there's a particularity. You need to enlarge the hole to 10.5 millimeters and slide it in. I'm inserting it here. It should normally go right up to the edge of the tray, and it's the same with the rock wool. Make sure to clear the insulation properly. And so With the sandwich panel, you'll have a screw that goes directly into the purlin plus the stitching screw, 6.3 by 45. So if you're on the slope like this, the purlin screw goes at the top and the 6.3 by 45 screw goes at the bottom. And similarly, if you're using dry decking, the screw will generally be an 85, 100 or 130 millimeter screw, depending on whether you're on a wooden purlin, but always at the top. If you put it at the bottom, it's not a problem, but by default, we put it at the top. And it's always with a pre-mounted washer. Be careful, don't forget, if we deliver the screws to you, they're usually supplied with the pre-mounted washer. Of course, if the decking has already been installed, you'll have to remove the existing saddle and the existing screw. This is actually the step I'm explaining here for the sandwich panel. Enlarge that specific hole, slide in the small insert, and do the same at the ridge. You still put 2 screws at the ridge. The CIO is not required at the ridge. You can place your lower riser directly on the cladding sheet. But if you're working with a sandwich panel, there are 2 screws. 1 stitching screw and 1 screw at the purlin. On the back sec, it's the same setup, except that there's only 1 screw at the purlin. The blocking riser, as I showed you earlier, goes on the wall plate purlin. Between the 8th and 9th module, it's usually on the 3rd rail. You'll have your blocking riser plus the lower riser. On all the other risers, you'll have the upper riser. Once you've installed all your risers, the blocking riser should always be aligned with the slope, like this. And then, where you don't have blocking risers, you'll have your upper risers. The upper riser actually has a small stop built into the material. So if you're carefully following the precise slope, if you're meticulously following the exact slope, you can simply slide your riser in like this all the way up to the designated stop, and you should always place it securely on top of the riser that was previously installed. So once you've successfully installed your initial blocking risers and your subsequent upper risers, well, you can start installing your rails. And of course, you'll find the same thing, a quick summary on the sandwich panel. Don't forget this little insert that you put on each purlin. And the CIO, of course, if you have a panel less than 45 millimeters thick, you don't have to put it on the ridge. Just like before, as I mentioned, you'll use a chalk line to align your rails. This alignment is important because it depends on where you'll start with your modules. But keep in mind that at a minimum, there should be 3 centimeters between the end of your rail and the start of your module. Often with Kogysun, you can start a little higher up. It depends how your generator ends. Check your diagonal from time to time, starting with your very first one, rail, second, third rail, to see if you're properly aligned. And then stretch a chalk line between the first and last rail. Of course, it will depend on your dimensions, on your roof. Over 100 meters, you'll have to do it several times. But over 30 meters, you can easily put a chalk line directly. For example, when laying out with 3 rails on the slope, you'll have splicing between your rails, so there is continuity between your rails, and you'll also need to put a locking screw, always on the upper rail, so always the rail on the slope, you move towards the slope. And as I mentioned earlier, where there was a separation between the 8th and 9th module, you have a continuity of rails, but with a slightly larger expansion gap. So since these are aluminum rails, you'll have a 2 centimeter gap between the rails. And this, you'll always find it on the upright. If you have more than 16 modules in a row, every 8 modules, you'll have this well-known gap. But otherwise, the first 2 or the next 2 are side by side, but between the 8th and 9th, between the 16th and 17th, you'll have this well-known 20 millimeter gap. So don't forget, never place a module straddling this gap. Never place a module across this well-known 20 millimeter gap. You can have it between the 1st and the 8th, or between the 4th and 5th module. You could very well have the 4th straddling the 2nd rail, but never between the 8th and 9th. The mounting screws are 6.3 by 25. The slides that I use, with these 2 little tabs here, and then the rail, I have 2 small rail samples here with these 2 little tabs here. So these 2 little tabs slide under the tab of the slide. And you slide the other one in. Be aware that with Kogysun, the modules are getting wider and wider, so we don't change our rails every time. But with Kogysun, you have a small 70mm insert here. You could even have up to 2 of them. Same thing, they slide between the 2, which allows you to extend your rails a bit. And you could have between 2 rails, in fact, 2 small 70mm spaces, so up to 14 centimeters. Don't fix anything yet, but know that if you have 2 full rails here, the sliders can be precisely positioned right at the purlin, either before or after, and you will securely fasten them no matter the specific rail type. If you find yourself here and your rail is situated right here, you would then come in with this specialized screw, which is designed for this particular application. You go straight through your rail plus your slider and you secure it. Actually, what you do is when you're fastening, you look at the 2 tabs here on your bracket and you place it between the 2. So of course, if you're further along, you'll just have the rail to fasten here, so always in the middle. It may also be that in your project, you need reinforcement. In that case, we'll provide 2 screws, and we'll also let you know about that in the project details. And if you're at the splice afterwards, so your first rail here, and if you're on the slope, in that case, it's just 1 screw. It's aluminum, so it's just for expansion. And you come in, there's a small groove. You position yourself directly between the rail and the splice, and you go through with this screw. 6.3 by 25, that's due to 4. So you have the same thing on panel sandwich panels as on backsec. Also know that on each splice, you are required to do the grounding. We don't supply it at Dom Solar, but be aware that for continuity, you are required to put a small clamp with 6 yellow sleeves, 6 square millimeters flexible. Be careful. Make sure you know exactly where your modules will be placed so that the screw doesn't get in the way once you've installed your clamps and that there's a module to be installed at that spot. Be very careful when you install this grounding and first mark out where your modules will be placed. So you'll find this on every splice along the slope. If you have 2 or 3, that's it. You are required to do it, even at the separation where there's a 20mm gap. And on every rail column, you will also need to meticulously connect all of the Kogysun rail columns together, utilizing at least a robust 6 square millimeter green, yellow, or an equivalent appropriately insulated wire. Furthermore, you may also find it necessary to incorporate microinverters or optimizers into your system, depending on the specific requirements and design of your solar installation. You need to be very careful. This is a part that we do not supply, but you can easily find it on websites that sell these parts. There you go then. Take the washer and use the 20mm screw height. You could find it at Kranich, for example, on the Kranich website. Be careful to maintain at least a 1 centimeter air gap all around so that your microinverter or optimizer doesn't fail. So make sure to respect this air gap. For grounding the modules, it's a claw-type ground from Moba Solar, which we don't distribute. You should contact Moba Solar directly. I'll show it to you on the screen. Here you have a small assembly with a rail, the essential support component, the lower spacer, the upper spacer, and the rail itself. This constitutes the complete module mounting system. It's often, therefore, a crucial part of the overall installation process. The claw-type ground, you have it. It's 1 claw-type ground per module. So you have the module mounting here. And when you tighten your module, you'll also need to install this specific claw, which you can place as close as possible because there's the cable return, so you definitely need to make a cable return. So the claw from Moba, you slide it in, and of course you can bring it as close as possible here. And then you tighten it once your modules are in place. It grips the frame of the module. And you tighten your module with a wrench, size 6, tighten to 14 newtons. So when installing the modules, you always start from the bottom of the array and align your first row. It's very important to be as straight as possible. So when installing the modules, don't connect them between the 8th and 9th. You have two external fastenings there. At the minimum, you have 8 centimeters. Tightening, 14 newtons. That's with a wrench. Hex head, 6. And then at the very bottom of the generator, specifically between the end of the rail and the module, you will need at least 3 full centimeters of clearance. Now I'm going to show you some layout plans. You can already see in this first project that there are separations between modules at different levels. You can see them here, but always between the 8th and 9th module, and of course the one next to it, the small generator. Since it doesn't start at the same level, we did it between the 8th and 9th module. You might end up not being at the same level. So it will all depend, in fact, on how your layout is and also how your spacings are. The key to successfully planning the layout is coordination. Here you can see several rail configurations, always with that well-known separation between the 8th and 9th module. At least 8 centimeters between the two modules, as we saw earlier in the presentation. What I want to draw your attention to is where the different risers will be located, and especially the blocking risers. Here you will typically have a lower riser along with its corresponding blocking riser. And as I previously mentioned earlier, it's always from the third rail that you will consistently have a lower riser and the blocking riser, which you can clearly see in this particular setup here, especially if we zoom in a little more closely. Lower the riser and blocking the riser, which are crucial components. Lower riser and blocking riser always after the 20 millimeter expansion joint. This is a crucial step in the installation process. The very first two rails are carefully positioned side by side. Following this, with the crucial splicing process, a precise splice is made right here, clearly marked by the specific module dimensions. Further splices are then meticulously placed here, and also here, and finally here, ensuring a robust connection. You can splice the video footage here, and also at this point, then again over here, and finally at this last location. Don't forget this very important small grounding connection point at each splice. So here, 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 obviously to be done on all the rails. What you need to pay attention to is to mark everything properly. Where your module clamps will fall. Here we are in the slides. So normally there shouldn't be any problem. It's mainly when you install your grounding connections that these little screws you put in the rail don't end up hitting the module clamp. So for example, in this particular case here, there is absolutely no problem whatsoever. Your module clamps are truly and completely inside the slides, ensuring a secure and proper fit. We might just need to pay attention to this assembly here. And always between the 8th and 9th module, never with this 20 millimeter expansion, never have a module straddling the 2nd and 3rd rail, always before. You always finish your 8th module first. Another example of layout planning. Here you can see a bit of the purlin structure. At the start of your project, always make sure to position your rails before cutting them. You have 4,290 millimeter rails, and some will need to be cut. Here's another example that could happen on a new project. It's this small piece of rail here that you'll need to add with a precise splice right here, and also right here, you see. To avoid having to install a ground connection between the two rails, what I recommend for such a small piece, such a short length of rail to add, is to simply use 2 small screws. In terms of expansion, it will not make a difference. So 2 small screws to hold your splice in place, and that ensures continuity. Do not bother leaving a 20 millimeter expansion gap. You can if you want, but it is not necessary. Just use 2 small screws. 1 screw with this rail, 1 screw with this rail here in the splices. Same for the one above. One screw here, one screw here. That way, your continuity is ensured and there's no need to install a ground connection. Unlike the rail here, where you have a small splice here, so a splice between two rails side by side, you have fewer than 8 modules. A connection, a ground connection is mandatory here and here. And then you'll need to add a fixed point here for this rail. Just a small screw, a bolt. The blocking spaces, you only have them at the bottom of the generator, since you have fewer than 8 modules. So the blocking spacer, lower spacer, plus the blocking spacer that you'll find at the purlin, sand yesterday here and here. No need to put any elsewhere. And here you'll only have lower spaces on all the other purlins with upper spaces. So project 3 is a bit of a special case with separations between generators here, here, and of course, since it was a bit damaged at the module level, you could, as the eave is here, so your slope is indicated on our plans, the direction of the slope is shown here, so here you're at the ridge, so the eave is down here. You start with the first module, leaving a gap here to follow along. In fact, along the entire length from edge to edge, you have the same separation on your generator. So here actually, you'll have a first rail with a expansion joint here at the bottom. So these are really special projects. We can have expansion joints. In fact, every 8 modules, but it depends on where you start. For example, here, this will be the first module, but if you look at the bottom of your generator, this is actually where your generator starts in this area. And it starts with a module. So you will actually start with a much lower initial riser and a sturdy blocking riser right here. And here, right here, indeed, we have something quite very interesting. Always after the expansion joint. You might also see this in projects with skylights, so on different roofs with a single sloped rail. This is for alignments. When you have just one rail like this is what will serve as your reference point to align your generator. It's a very good idea to consistently use this sturdy rail right here as your primary reference point. This precise location is exactly where you will carefully place your chalk line to accurately align your generator. You will always, without fail, find your lower riser and your blocking riser clearly visible and positioned right here and right here, respectively. No. There is no need for any additional rail components, primarily because you currently have fewer than 8 modules positioned on a slope. In this specific configuration, you will utilize your 2 primary rails, placing them carefully side by side. Once they are properly aligned, you can then smoothly and precisely slide them into this designated area, ensuring a secure and stable fit for your setup. Don't forget the always important grounding, of course, to remember. One last project. We present all the projects to you, as I mentioned, with the bill of materials. The gaps between the columns are 9 millimeters by default. If you want more, please let us know well in advance. And here you have 8 modules, 9 modules on the slope. Of course, between the 8th and 9th, there is a separation. You don't have a choice. So 2 rails on the slope plus, and then there will be a third rack that will be spliced, so you will always end up with a complete and functional system. With the spliced rails, there's continuity in the rails here, spliced here and spliced here. Here, you have a longer rail, so you have a fixed point at each splice at the top of the rail. So here, the blue rail will have a fixed point. There, the red rail with a fixed point, so a bracket that goes through the rail plus the splice. And the robust lower brackets precisely positioned at the 2 critical lock points that you can clearly identify here and also over here are essential. Of course, in these specific areas, you will find the smoothly operating sliding parts. These crucial sliding components are also securely attached with the durable lower bracket and the specially designed locking bracket, ensuring a firm and stable connection. Furthermore, it is absolutely imperative that you do not forget the vital grounding connection for each and every splice, which is located right here to ensure electrical safety and proper functionality. And here, of course. There you go. We've reached the end of this Kogysun presentation. Feel free to visit our website. You'll find information, technical reviews, and you can even submit your request for a quote. And we also have a little search engine where you can easily look up the various modules and carefully check if in your current selection of modules you already have a suitable option. How should I put it? The right module. So there's a small search engine. You simply just have to enter. The manufacturer, for example, Longi, it will search for you, and then you choose. So I'll just do it randomly. I'm not saying we'll land on Kogysun, and it will show you which system you have with us. And with the certification, whether you're in the ETN or in the technical review with all the systems, Trina, it will certainly find you another suitable one, a much better option for you. This can already give you an idea if you're in the technical review or not, or in the ETN, and along the way, maybe it will become certified. Don't hesitate to ask our sales team if certification is in progress or not. Thank you for following this training. Kogysun. And in any case, after watching this, you will automatically receive your certificate. Otherwise, if you still have questions about your projects or your system, don't hesitate to send me your questions. Be sure to include the file number, starting with F or E, as well as the project name and your list of questions. There you go. Well, I wish you a good day and a great start to your project. Thank you. Goodbye.